Bravo. Thank you. Okay. Well, I will not take too much time because I think it's far more interesting if we can exchange and if you can raise your issues and your questions. And I'm as interested as what you have to say, what your concerns are, as you might be interested in what I have to say. First of all, thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for your hospitality in the Netherlands, a country that I have great memories and that I'm very fond of. Actually, part of my family lives in the Netherlands, and I'm very pleased to say that they're here today, hiding in the audience. So there is a family connection here. And I've had less than 24 hours in your country, but I've had a chance to spend quite a bit of time with Jeroen, your Minister of Finance. We are on a first-name basis, I'm afraid to say, because we spent many nights together.
That sounds interesting.
It was okay.
Okay.
And very proper, I hasten to add. Yeah, you might be disappointed, but that's the way it is. And I was very, very privileged to have had an audience with you, your new king, which was certainly a privilege from my perspective because he shows great interest in not only his many, many duties, but he's greatly interested in financial inclusion, in financial information and the harmonization of financial information. It's actually a project that his wife pushed very much a few years back, and on which we partner with the Netherlands. And I was very grateful to him and to her for pushing those issues of financial inclusion. And I had a great session this morning with the governor of the central bank. And before I came here, I was even more privileged because I had an encounter with some of your great masters. And here I have to confess that I stopped for 30 minutes at the Rijksmuseum, which gave me a chance to see the Night Watch yet again and a few of the Rembrandt paintings that I really admire very much. But you're not here to listen to me tell you all about the beauties and the virtues of Dutch economics or Dutch paintings, let alone Dutch royalty. I suppose you're interested in what the IMF does, what we think about the global economy at the moment, and what's the relevance of all that to the Netherlands, I guess. So in terms of what the IMF does, who is the IMF, I'll just ask you to think of a club. It's a club that 188 countries belong to which they pay their due, and of which they agree to respect the rules. Now, what is the purpose of the club? It's not the Ajax d'Amsterdam. Congratulations to them, by the way. But it's a club which has the duty of helping with financial stability around the world, and which has essentially 3 business lines to do that. I compare it with business lines because I come myself from the corporate world, and I'm not a civil servant by background, so I associate quite easily with those of you who study business as much as I try to associate with those of you who study economics. Those 3 business lines are, 1, what we call surveillance. What do we do as the IMF, this club of 188 countries? Well, annually, almost for all countries, but annually for all the large members, we go and inspect the economies of those countries. So we look at what budget policies the authorities have, what monetary policies are enforced, what the economic situation is from all perspectives, from all economic players' perspective, and we make recommendations. Now, that's the traditional role of the IMF. It's this bilateral relationship between the institution and 188 countries. And every year, we actually report, and we publish the report. So we say, this economy is running well, or this economy is running okay, and there should be modifications to the policy mix that they have in place, because it would improve growth, it would improve the creation of jobs, it would improve the supervision of the monetary system. And gradually that line of business has evolved into being more multilateral. In other words, when we look at a country, we also look at what the consequences of its policy will be to other parts of the world. I'll give you one example. At the moment, because of the international economic crisis that affect predominantly the advanced economies, the monetary policies from around the world, US, UK, Japan, European Central Bank, I know Mario was here and I'm sure he explained that to you, had to go into more inventive, more innovative monetary policy in order to give authorities a bit of a breathing space to actually have more appropriate fiscal policies, and I'll come back to that later. To do that, to have innovative and inventive monetary policies, they had to expand in one area. They had to buy different products from what they were buying normally. They had to increase the monetary mass in some ways. They had to go into what some call quantitative easing. They had to use different targets. They had to throw a lot of liquidity at the banks when there was a risk of a liquidity crunch. So all those things have an effect both in their domestic territory, where they have competence, but also elsewhere. Because when you increase monetary mass, when you move liquidities levels, then it tends to go where it is suitable, appropriate, and generates good yields. So there are consequences in other parts of the world, and that's often how you see the price of commodities, for instance, rise, or that's where you see the movement of capital flows in other directions than was normally expected. So we try to study that as well. This is all under the heading of surveillance. I'm still in my first line of business. Second line of business is very traditional. You're familiar with it. You alluded to it. It's lending. When a country is in trouble, when a country has current account big issues, and when a country cannot access the normal financing through the financial markets, it calls on the IMF. And as a member of the club, it is entitled to draw some support under some consideration. So it's a give and take process, and it works contractually. We act as agent for the lenders, the 187, and we act as a guarantor of the implementation of consideration by the borrower. So a country that is in trouble for some reason. We try to explain why it is in trouble. We try to explain how it can get out of trouble. We lend money, and the country agrees to do the things that we believe will work to get it out of trouble. That's the lending activity that we conduct. And at the moment, we have roughly 50 countries under program, as we call it, or having a program, because they're typically the owners of their destiny, and they're the owners of the conditions that they want to put in place to improve the situation. And the majority of those programs are where? Guess.
Europe.
Okay, another one. Yes, the majority of those programs, in terms of numbers of programs, are in Africa. You're quite right. But if you talk about the financial volume committed by the fund to a particular area, you are right, or whoever else said Europe is right. So at the moment, number of countries with a program, highest number, Africa. Volume of money committed by the IMF and lent to those countries, Europe, and particularly the Eurozone. The third line of business, and I'll be done with what the IMF does, and I will have spoken way too long, is technical assistance. What we do typically is offer technical assistance that we either finance ourselves or that is financed by donor countries that have an interest in seeing one part of the world better ruled, better organized, with its public finance in better order, with its debt managed well, and so on and so forth, with its banking supervision better organized. Those are the typical areas of business that we provide technical assistance and capacity building for. One of the areas of the world that receives a lot of capacity building at the moment is...
Again, Europe?
No.
Oh.
Well, we do a bit in Europe, but not as much as in... Come on, a region
Asia.
that is moving. No, we do that too, but...
Southern America.
No.
Oh, we know, got
We're
almost
just guessing
everything
now.
now.
A region in transition at the moment. Yes, got it. The Middle East.
The audience smarter than we.
The 8 countries that are undergoing massive transformations at the moment, at different pace, are taking a lot of technical assistance from us. Think of a country like Libya, for instance. that is really transitioning, that does not have a very established governing system and that wants to operate better, they eat a lot of technical assistance and capacity building from us. Now, I see hands being raised, so I'm assuming that people are fed up with me talking and they would like to raise their questions. Is that right?
Well, let's start with a question. We already have some student question implemented. Thank you for your remarks, Mrs. Lagarde, about the IMF. You already told about your day yesterday. You met Jeroen, as you can call him, and you met Willem-Alexander, also first name base with him.
Oh, His Majesty, I would say.
Okay. Well, it's... I don't understand.
I think they're interrupting.
I think they're interrupting. They want to say something about it, but maybe we come further to it. Yeah.
They're doing it ultimate live.
Yeah. Well,
Ms. Lagarde, this is what we're not prepared. I think the audience want to interrupt.
well, let's go on.
We have to continue.
Yeah. Okay.
Ms. Lagarde, this is what we're not prepared. You probably
That's
can
okay.
understand.
That's fine.
But, well, it just happened. And I think the audience also want to know, did you understand what they were saying? No, I really want to ask the audience to stop interrupting on this way. I think we have to stop to interrupt on this way. We want to have a proper chat with you.
And proper conversation, a proper Q&A.
But, well, we heard the audience, and did you understand what they were saying?
Well, we
This
try
is
it for a third time. Did you understand what they were saying or not?
Not quite.
Oh, not quite. It's
Maybe
not
we
very
just
loud.
must
I think they're
continue.
referring to the Greek question, and I can tell the audience that we're going to talk about that, and that we also had some Q&A from people who just visit Athens. So if you wait a little bit more, we're going to discuss that. Well,
I think it's a really rude way to interrupt. Ms. Lagarde, sorry for this.
Oh dear.
so we're really apologizing for the behavior of these people. Well, maybe. Is this something that you have often?
Well, maybe we can just carry on.
Maybe
Yeah.
let's just continue, and then
discuss
people can
this shit.
listen to what we are
Because
talking.
you know there are places in the world where the IMF is questioned and the validity of what we recommend is in question.
Yeah.
And it's obviously what we pursue is, as I said earlier on, stability.
Yeah.
Clearly, there is a need of that at the moment for a
Yeah.
stable discussion to be had. But whenever we intervene, it's in a situation where the country has experienced trouble, has not taken the measures to
That
either
they-
balance
yeah.
its budget or make sure that its current account situation is okay. So it's often the case that people will argue and challenge that the decisions are the right ones because they are often tough decisions.
Yeah,
And
it's not really easy to make them, I think.
it's difficult to make them, it's difficult to implement them. You know, when a country has to reduce its deficit, when a country has to reform its economy to make sure that young people can access the economy, can create business, can get jobs, those are difficult things to do most of the time. And the only reason the IMF is involved is because the decisions have not been made at the right time and in good order. So we are often seen as the bad guys. So, you know, that
And a bad
is,
girl.
I did not really understand everything that was being said.
Yeah.
But yeah, we are seen as the people asking for tough measures to be taken, right?
Because we saw some turmoil here, but there's also turmoil on the streets of Athens.
Yeah.
The Greeks are angry with the IMF and with the Troika. Do you understand that they are angry?
Well, what is difficult for them is obviously not to find jobs easily, to have an economy that is shrinking rather than expanding. But it's, you know, the case that either there have been bubbles that have been tolerated. It's the case that the ingredients for growth have not been put together,
Yeah.
and jobs are not created. So that's why people are taking a hit, and that's why they are suffering as a result.
So you understand? Yeah.
But I think that, you know, what's important is for actually the governments in place in those countries to explain to their population, to explain to their voters why it is important to go through a process that is painful in order to then reach a stage where the economy will grow, will produce job, and will improve the standard of living for people.
Reforming is hard. To implement the reforms
Yeah.
you suggest is
Yes,
really hard.
Yes,
And
that's right.
well, people feel that when they can't find a job and well, do not have a really high income anymore.
Correct, and that is the case in many countries where there has been a high level of stability in the past, and where going through the process is painful.
Because, for example, in Greece, well, the debt they have was really high. There was a haircut on it, and it's still really high, isn't it? And why I suggest this is because their debt is really high. Is there a possibility their economy can grow while they still have that high debt?
For the moment, the Greek economy has not grown. Okay, it has shrunk rather than grown, and it is still going through that process.
We saw it in the World Economic Outlook.
Yeah, correct. And yet they have adjusted by about 15% of GDP, which means that they have made their public finance a lot healthier. And the hope for the program that was put together with the Greek authorities is that they would improve their competitiveness in order to restore their position and be able to yet again make the economy grow, export to the rest of the world, and have that sort of internal devaluation that cannot be produced by a devaluation of the euro, given that Greece is part of the eurozone.
Yeah. We had a student question about Greece, but before that we had another student question. Maybe it's time for it, Philip?
Yes. Is he on?
No, you had to stand it in before. We prefer students because we're a student platform. You had all the option to send them in. But maybe you can do it afterwards. Well, we're all students in our life. Philip, first question.
Yes, I'm sitting here together with Zlatina Bajeva, and she has a question about IMF.
Hello. My question is about the unspoken rule that the head of the World Bank is an American and the managing director of the IMF comes from Western Europe. And do the other members, the ones with less voting power in the IMF, think that it is fair for an European to be heading the IMF if Europe hasn't taken control of the crisis just yet?
I'm pleased that you asked the tough questions, and that's a tough one. I think there has been a historic tradition for the last 60 years of that balance of power. There's no reason to, deny that. It's also been the case that the recruiting process has tried to identify persons that are suitable for the job, that have the ability to rein in the energy of all the ingredients of the IMF, which is the staff, the economist and the non-economist, the board members that represent these 188 members that I mentioned earlier on. So not to say that I'm the best qualified person, but I think I was not selected simply because I was a European, and my predecessors neither, but also because the boards and the members of the institution thought that it was appropriate to have us selected. Now, the non-Europeans and non-American members on the board represent roughly 48% of the membership in terms of people around the table. And this is shifting. So you have less and less European voice and advanced economies voice, although there's still a majority for the moment, and more of the emerging market economies and the developing countries having a voice and having quota, which is the way by which you are a member of the club and determine you standing in the club. And that is growing, and it will continue to grow. We are actually at the IMF one of the very few international institutions where the shift of power has begun to change and will continue to change. We have a big quota reform underway, a big governance reform underway, which I hope will be completed before the end of the year. And we continue to review the quota formula that identifies what role is played by each member. So it's shifting, and there will be a day, no question about it, when the IMF and the World Bank and international institutions alike will be headed by non-Europeans and non-Americans, certainly.
It was an advantage for you being the managing director of the IMF, for being in Europe, because the center of the crisis is now in Europe. So was that a benefit? Was it an advantage?
Well, it's
for
one of
that
the focus
position?
regions you mentioned before.
I think it is. Some people would regard it as an advantage because a European knows the European partners and the European players and the complex European rules by which life is organized in Europe. Some people will say, no, it's not a benefit, it's actually a disadvantage because there is a tendency for the Europeans to favor and support the Europeans. So in whatever I decide and our European department decides, we are very mindful of that. And I hasten to add that our European department includes many, many non-Europeans. Is headed by somebody who is half British and half Iranian. So you could argue that he's half non-European and half British.
Yeah, interesting combination.
Sytske mentioned it before. The Euro region is one of the critical regions in the world right now for the IMF. I was wondering, how many time in a week do you spend on the Eurozone? And probably every week is different, but on average.
If you compare it with, for instance, Africa, where IMF is also really active.
I probably spend at the moment about half of my time on European issues, on a country basis, because I also have to deal with internal issues having to do with the institutions. But in terms of time and energy spent, it's probably half Euro area, half rest of the world. But that's not surprising, because that's where we have the heart of the problem at the moment, or the part of the financial crisis problem that is not yet resolved.
You already told us that you're on first name basis with Jeroen. Mario was also here 2 weeks ago. I also heard only a first name there. What's the frequency of your contact with him, with Mario Draghi, with Olli Rehn? You're operating in the Troika together?
We are in either phone, text or mail basis on a weekly basis.
Yeah. That's literally not. And last week, Mario Draghi cut their interest rates. Did you already know that he was going to do that?
No.
No? He didn't make a call.
That's still a secret.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and I think it's, the relationship between central banks in general and the IMF is on a very arm's length basis. So we do talk to each other, we do communicate. When we do Article 4 review, we certainly talk to them at length about their monetary policy, but we never interfere with the decision-making process of the banks.
But did you expect his announcement that the interest cut of the ECB will go to an all-time low?
I read the newspapers like you, and I'm very attentive to the messages that Mario gives. He's very mindful of what he says, and I sort of figured that it was coming.
Yeah.
All right.
He didn't tell you, did he?
Well, we tried to, but he
we
didn't
tried
answer
to
the
ask
question.
That's the reason he's probably the president of the European Central
Yeah.
Bank. The concept of the IMF it exists from 1948, and it always worked together with the World Bank. And now, while the IMF is intervening in Europe, you had to work together with the European Commission and the European Central Bank. Probably the role of the IMF changed in their general recipe. Did you feel that? Or
I think it was not the first time that we were working with other partners, but clearly all the programs that we discussed and all the rescue that we put in place with members of the Troika were a different pattern and required a lot of consultation, a lot of work together, and sometimes compromises. But we always try to to adhere to the lines that we think is the right line for country recovering.
Well, but the ECB and the European Commission are really prominent institutions in Europe. And I think you cannot compare them to other institutions, big institutions in other continents, because
that's true.
We have the project
and because
Europe.
Europe is itself a very special construction.
It's really a challenge.
It's a different way of operating because you have to work on a team basis. When we go and do a review of, say, the Greek program, which we have just done at the moment, we have to be together on the ground. There are 3 representatives. We do the homework together. We conclude the day with working sessions together. So there is a process that is different. But I think at the end of the day, the solutions, the process of reviewing progress is the same.
You say you work a lot together, but normally you're the woman in charge. And how do you convince them in meetings? Because we know from Jeroen Dijsselbloem that those meetings can take 18 hours or something. How do you convince them? And how do you stay awake? That kind of things. That's also important for getting a good...
well, I think it's important for all of us. And whether you are a student, whether you're a professor, whether you're a journalist, whether you're an activist, whether you're a head of the IMF, it's the same. You have one single body, and you're not going to get much by way of replacement. So you'd better work on it and make sure that it's going to sustain your brain. So I do what most of you, I hope, do is, eat well, don't drink too much, don't smoke too much. Exercise as much as you can, and clearly, you live in a country where exercise is part of life.
And if we do that, we can become managing director of the IMF.
Well,
that sounds like a good deal to me.
Is it time for a student question?
Yes, I think I'll first want to address another thing, and then it's time for the student question of Timo Klein. Maybe you can already walk to the mic. Well, we saw it already, that the reaction towards the institution are very heavy, also in Athens.
Yep.
And the Troika has quadrupled the amount of bodyguards that's in their entourage the past years. How do you feel about that when your own employees are under attack in countries like that? How does that feel?
As I said earlier, when a program decided by a country with the support of the Troika in the Eurozone is difficult, and it is difficult because of the circumstances that have preceded those conditions, it's always the case that people try to find a scapegoat. Or goatscape, whatever you call it. Goatscape, huh? Scapegoat is the better way to put it. Scapegoat. So we are often seen as a scapegoat. And my first duty to the IMF is to make sure that the employees who work at the IMF are safe, can do their job, and will not be under threat. So if the situation so requires, we should have a number of people to help them and to make sure that they're safe.
Yeah. Okay, I think it's time for the next student question.
Okay, is it on? Yes. My name is Timo Klein. I'm a student in economics here at the university. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank you for coming here and having this critical discussion with us. Also, I'd like to thank the committee for organizing this. And I think it's a bit of a shame with the activists that they're hampering this critical discussion because we're actually able to ask direct questions to you. So, one of these questions I'd like to ask. Last month, we went to Athens with a group of 30 students. We met with local students there. We went to companies, we went to universities. And we saw with our own eyes how the economic situation is there. It's, of course, deteriorating quite fast. And what was very remarkable is that it is actually deteriorating a lot faster than the IMF projected a couple of years ago. 2 or 3 years ago, they projected that it would have already be back in the growth area. Now they're not. Employment is 20% higher than projected. Youth unemployment is 60%. Poverty is increasing. My question is, what does this do with the credibility of the IMF when their projections are so much off the actual numbers?
Well,
it's a tough question.
It's never good for your credibility when your forecast is off the mark and you compare forecast and reality. And I think it's the duty of the IMF to acknowledge, recognize, compare forecast, compare that with reality, and try to understand why it is that we thought that by now growth would be back when it's actually minus 4%. And we have done that, which has created a little bit of economic discussions, let's call it that way. When Olivier Blanchard, the Chief Economic Council, actually published in last October and then later on in the year a special paper on fiscal multipliers to really reanalyze and confront our forecasts with the reality and try to explain the reasons why he now believes that fiscal multipliers were certainly higher than initially contemplated. I think it has to do with the fact that we are going through the worst economic and financial crisis that we've seen in decades, probably ever since the 30s. And there are a number of factors that either we had not seen emerged in previous crises, a correlation and a combination and synchronization of financial crises in multiple countries that actually drained masses of countries, not just one country at a time, not just one small group, or not just the Asian, or not just the Russian countries or the Latin American countries, but the entire global scene was engulfed in that 2008 financial crisis. And I think the synchronization / correlation of all that added to the financial crisis, which made it a lot worse, led to us and many others, we were not the only one, which doesn't excuse us, but which led all of us to underestimate the fiscal multipliers in many ways.
Sorry to interrupt, can I interpret it as saying that with the knowledge that we have now on the progress of, for instance, the Greek economy, that the measures that were taken or designed by the Troika in 2010 were not the right measures to solve the economic problem in Greece?
No, I wouldn't draw that conclusion, and it's obviously something that we have discussed internally with the team. And despite the change in the fiscal multipliers, the team is still convinced that the set of measures that have been recommended and that have been adopted were necessary measures. I'll give you a few examples. The fact that tax has to be collected across the country, and that big taxpayers cannot get away with evading taxation in Greece, for instance. The fact that the pensions in Greece, ever since the accession to the Eurozone, skyrocketed about 3 times as fast as any other pension scheme in the Eurozone. The fact that the civil service is much inflated relative to the civil service in any other country. The fact that the unit labor cost is way higher than, for instance, Portugal, or 10 times higher than countries in the vicinity of Greece that are clear competitors. You see, all these measures require, not all these measures, but all these factors required measures that needed to be taken. What we underestimated is the consequences of it, that's clear.
So yeah, I think the message that you name is the last question, I promise. The message that you're stating are out of the question. There's of course something has to be done with tax collection, pensions, etc. But what I'm wondering is that now the current situation is with all the austerity and the reforms is that there's so many factors of production laying idle. Youth unemployment of 60%, people with master degrees who are now moving outside of the country. How can you expect the country to return back to growth when there's so many factors of production laying idle because of liquidity problems or because healthy companies go bankrupt because banks are not lending to them?
Those are big issues. You call them hysteresis, if I recall my vague economic background, and where the factors of production have actually deteriorated. People have lost their knowledge, know-how, technical expertise, and they just cannot go back to where they were or produce as they used to produce. So I think it's one of the reasons why the European Investment Bank, for instance, has to get involved in Greece, and why the euro area partners have to give a hand to kickstart growth factors again and reinflate the economy by providing re-education, rehabilitation into professional and vocational training so that people can get back to it and fill the gap, if you will, that has been created over the past few years.
Yeah.
On a restored situation from a financial point of view.
Timo, thank you for your question. While referring to Olivier...
Can I go back to your question, actually, because there's one part which is important.
Of course.
Which is banks lending. You mentioned that. I think it applies to Greece, but it applies to many other banks in the Eurozone. And I think it's a critical factor that banks has to be back to their business of lending to enterprises, of lending to SMEs, of lending to households, and not, just keep their retained earnings to increase their capital as they should, but also be back on the job of lending to the real economy. That's a fundamental shift that has still to take place. We're not seeing it, and I think central bankers, I don't know if you've discussed it with Mario, but central bankers can play a role in that.
But how should they? Should they force banks to lend money to the small and medium-sized enterprises?
They see.
Can they do that?
The paradox at the moment is that Mario, for instance, in the Eurozone, has, as you saw, reduced the interest rate, and the interest rate is rock bottom at the moment. Yet, if you are a small enterprise in Spain, for instance, or if you're a small enterprise anywhere in the Eurozone, you are very unlikely to get a rock bottom rate. You're going to get a high rate, a high interest rate for the borrowing that you will expect. So there is something here that is not working. And I think central bankers have to get together and try to identify what is stopping banks from actually doing their job.
But isn't
and
part of the
lending.
problem of that they're not lending their money of the capital requirements? Banks have to have large buffers and stuff like that?
It's probably one of the reasons, but I'm not sure it's the only reason.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe back to Greece. I had one extra question about it. Is there maybe one sustainable level of debt?
That's another controversial issue. You remember that there are two good economists that put their brain together and came up with lots of
Working papers.
working
and
papers and
you mean a
conclusions.
Lagarde Reinhold?
Yeah. I
We
think
have a student
that's
question about
yeah.
that later. Yeah.
That's the 90% threshold that you're referring to. Clearly, there has been some challenges to those findings, but I think it remains true that countries cannot carry on huge debt on their back. It's as if you were running with a bag full of stones. It's hard, and the lighter the bag, the faster you can run.
Can we summarize it in one number? Maybe 1%?
No, you know why? Because I think it very much depends on the nature of the debt, whether it's domestically held, whether it's partly domestically, partly foreign held, and where in the development cycle the country is. So I wouldn't come up with a number.
No,
Look at Japan. Japan has 220%
It's a lot.
debt, which is huge.
Yeah.
The Eurozone has less debt altogether than the US. And many emerging market economies have much lower debt, which is normal with their development cycle. So no single number is going to work.
Well, you started talking about Reinhard Rogan. We actually had a student question about that. Philip?
Yeah, this is Birk Jonker, and he has a question about this.
Yeah, because you say that it doesn't. It's still a big problem, but as the Reinhard and Rogoff paper was basically slashed by a graduate student who redid their econometrics and found a mistake in even their Excel sheet, which is quite bad for a Harvard professor. But
but it shows that students have, can demonstrate a lot.
yeah, but that raises a lot of uncertainty when even such an influential paper as it was, because it was the only empirical paper that backed the austerity part of the debate. So it shows that there is a lot of uncertainty. How does the IMF take such uncertainty in mind when they give policy recommendations / demands?
Well, first of all, we have lots of economists that do their own research and their own paper, who generally don't work on Excel spreadsheets, but do, a lot of modeling, which doesn't mean to say that they don't make mistakes. We all do, and they try to base their conclusions, their analysis, and their recommendations on the basis of their own research. They take into account everybody else's research, but I don't think they take anything for granted. And I've asked the question to our chief economic counsel. I said, Olivier, does that, should we revisit everything we've said and all our opinions about debt sustainability? And his conclusion was, no, we need to do it on a constant basis, and we do review the criteria that we use to determine debt sustainability on a regular basis, because if there is one thing that I've learned over the last 2 years, it's that nothing can be generalized. Everything has to be country specific. Everything has to be tailored to the specific needs, to the specific moment in the cycle of development of economies. And it needs revisitation all the time, which means that we will regularly admit that we've made mistakes, or that we need to correct this, or that we need to improve that over the course of time and evolution.
In the studies, does the IMF also have found differences, for instance, between Greece and the Netherlands or Germany when it comes to austerity or fiscal stimulation?
Well, there is a significant cultural difference between one country and the other, and I'm not pointing, the finger at one or the other. It's cultural. It's ingrained in in the DNA of countries. I don't think that you have a particular issue with tax collections, for instance. You don't need to reform completely from A to Z your tax collection system, as a country like Greece has accepted that it has to.
Birk, thank you for the question, and I think he started the next topic, because we are now talking about the fundamentals of the economic science, and well, he mentioned it already, there is a discussion right now about austerity versus stimulating. And we all know the IMF as an institution which is focused on austerity, while last year, of the year before, last year, the IMF was the first institute, when we compare it to the ECB or the European Commission, who advocate less austerity. Where was this turning point, or when was this turning point?
I'm not sure you should call it a turning point. I think it's, as I said...
Can you imagine, I see it as a turning point.
We are not dogmatic. We are trying to be pragmatic, rational, and we try to provide substantive evidence of why we are advocating this, that, or the other. We don't think that austerity and growth are mutually exclusive. We do not think that fiscal consolidation, which is one way to translate the principle of austerity, that fiscal consolidation in and of itself will suffice to restore and help the economy recover. We believe that it's a combination of fiscal consolidation in the right amount and at the right pace, depending on the country's circumstances.
It's all about
We believe, I'll give you the three components and then I'll come back. So it's fiscal consolidation in the right amount and at the right pace, with anchoring in the medium term. We believe that it should be accompanied by the right monetary policy as well. And we believe that it has to be substantiated, if you will, or grounded in structural reforms that will transform the economies. I'll give you one example. The US economy at the moment, to get out of Europe for a little bit, the US economy is planning on too much fiscal consolidation. If you add the normal fiscal consolidation path and the sequestration on the top of it, it's too much. The economy would be contracting by, over 1.5%.
So they should stimulate more, Obama?
No, they should consolidate less in the short term, but they should give, a horizon which gives economic actors the certainty that there will be fiscal consolidation going forward, and that there will be a way to deal with entitlements as well, so that economic actors, understand where they sit, where they stand, where they invest, and what is the constraints within which they will operate.
So it's a complex discussion, but still, for us students, it looked for a few years very black and white. For instance, 3 years ago, everyone's taking the 3% norm very seriously, and you were not taken serious as an economist if you didn't uphold the 3% norm. But there has clearly been a shift in the public debate. And do you feel responsible for the IMF for that shift? Because you were one of the first serious institutes to advocate it.
I think we clearly advocated that a nominal target, there is nothing magical about a nominal target other than it being a target. And for some countries, for some countries it will remain important to have that target, somewhere there. But we believe that, and we have said consistently that it was far more important to have a structural deficit objective and to make sure that countries could reach that objective. Which means that, what it means is, if growth comes down, you don't have to adjust more in order to reach the 3%. That's the other way of saying, let the automatic stabilizers play out and continue your structural consolidation.
And the European Commission also agrees with this kind of thinking right now, because last week Olli Rehn announced that the Netherlands and France are getting more time. France is getting 2 years delay, the Netherlands 1. Why don't you think that France is getting 2 and the Netherlands are only getting 1 year delay? What's the difference between France and the Netherlands?
Well, I'm sure there are many differences. To begin, there are slight variation in the current deficit between the two countries. And as I said, not all countries are the same, and
Is
you
the
have to
slide-
drill down into the, the roots of the economy, the way it works, where the savings are, how the financial system operates, what is the ability to rein deficit, and how much tax there is in one country versus the other, before you actually get to, okay, 1 more year here, 2 more years there. I'm sure there has been a dialogue between the authorities.
But did it surprise you that a country as Italy didn't get any delay?
That which country?
Italy, for instance.
Well, again, I'm sure there has been a dialogue, and I'll remind you that Italy is below the 3%, is at 2.9%, so it puts it in a different position relative to the others, I suppose.
And the European Commission was also an institution which always focused on those symbols like 3%. They all said, well, that magic number, you have to focus on that. Well, last week, they said they gave some more time to France and the Netherlands, as Sytske before. Did you expect it? And do you also see a shift in their policy?
The fact that they are allowing more time is a good move, and one that they had begun to advocate and begun to articulate,
You
a
should
few
not
months
expect
back.
of those institutions.
They, I think, are sticking with the objective of, in the medium term, reducing debt in each of the countries and making sure that public finances are in better shape. But they are allowing more time because they see that they should let growth pick up. Because, as everybody knows, when there is growth, everything is much easier. When you have growth, you can reduce your deficit better and faster. You can change the trajectory of debt faster as well. So I think what's behind, their change is, let's make sure that growth can take off in those countries, but let us also look at the medium-term horizon and make sure that we restore public finances.
I think we also had a student question about this topic.
We have a...
There were
Philip, there is another
Yeah.
student question was submitted.
Philip, next student.
Well, our next...
Let him speak.
Weakness not to be able to give him the space to talk.
Why
I
can't
heard the
he
question was about the credibility from the IMF, maybe.
talk? No, I'm happy to answer his question if he's asking a student question.
What's the student question? Sir? What's your question? But we're tight on schedule, so...
There you go.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions.
Good morning.
Good morning. Firstly, how do you think Iceland handled the crisis? And secondly, why does the IMF choose to impose Western capitalism on third world countries and thus giving multinationals an unfair advantage?
I think the second one is more a statement. Maybe you can go to the first question.
No, I'm going to take his 2 questions because I think
Thank you.
it's important to deal with it. On your question about Iceland, it was the triggering factor within the zone, and it was a country that had far exceeded the equilibrium that one should have between the size of the banking sector, the size of the country, and how it had structured its banking. How would I put it? Exploratory investigations outside Iceland, because that was the situation of those banks, where they had multiple branches and subsidiaries outside of Iceland, particularly in a country like the Netherlands, like clearly the Nordic countries, or like the UK. So they had to rein that in. And this is a process by which they went through by reducing the size of the banks, but by having the support of their partners, and the Nordic countries in particular supported a lot the programs in Iceland. I think they are getting there. I would observe, for the record, because I might not be an activist in all respects, but I'm an activist when it comes to women. I would observe, for the record, that the women were in charge of sorting out the banks in Iceland, and that worked out reasonably well and better than it would have otherwise. And on your second question, we're not imposing a particular system. We are trying to be rational about what can actually balance an economy. And we are very much advocating equilibrium and not disequilibrium. If you look at our studies and if you look at what we published recently a paper that actually advocates for more inclusive growth, that actually empirically demonstrates that growth is more sustainable if it is better shared, if there is inclusion, if the fruits of growth are better shared within countries. And that works both for the advanced economies as well as for the emerging market of the developing countries. And it's a point that we make when we review an economy. When the Gini coefficient is way out of line, we do say so. But our job is to say, look at the numbers, look at the research, look at what it demonstrates, and our job is to say it works better and growth will be better if you actually share it more within your country. Then it's for governments to make their decision, hopefully democratically, because we also operate as democratic institutions. But we don't avoid the subject. We do say so when we see that, you know, with high inequality, growth is prone to major accident.
Yeah, thank you for your question. We had another student question, Philip.
I didn't shy away from your question. I tried to deal...
Well, thanks for answering it.
Thanks for answering.
Yeah, there was a question sent in by Lionel Uitenhoven. Here you go.
Good morning. Ms. Lagarde, earlier at Room for Discussion, several very serious persons have spoken in favor of austerity on fiscal constraints by the Dutch government. For example, Klaas Knot, he said, cut the Dutch government spending, that will lead to more investor confidence and outweigh any drag on growth it causes. Jeroen Dijsselbloem, I have to say his full name, but he also said, cut the Dutch government spending, real growth comes only from structural reforms. And last is Mario Draghi. He said, cut the Dutch government spending, but don't raise taxes. Fiscal consolidation is unavoidable and not incompatible with growth. You said that, I think,
exclusive.
yesterday, I think, that you are happy that the Dutch government has granted delay to reach the 3% budget deficit limit. What, if any, mistakes are these men making? Could you comment on that?
It's a lot to comment on.
You know, I was brought up, if you will, in the private sector, in the corporate world. And I spent a portion of my professional life in the public service as well. I think that there is good public spending, and I think that there is public spending that goes wasted. So public spending invested in infrastructure, for instance. Public spending that will emulate, activate, engage, and support private sector investment initiatives, the setting up of startups, the setting up of SMEs, the development of SMEs, the protection of patent, the expansion of broadband at a high speed. All of that is part of the good public spending, if you will. When the public sector reinvents itself in trying to be an entrepreneur or an investor competing with the private sector, I have not seen cases where it was actually more efficient, more beneficial to either the economic sector or to the job creation, which is why, you know, I take the view that good public spending should be maintained as much as possible to the extent that it supports the economy, encourages it, rallies other support, and PPPs in that respect are quite helpful in many corners. But I also believe that the private sector, the initiatives, the entrepreneurial spirit is something that needs to be able to prosper.
But could you understand that for students here in the hall, that it's a little bit of confusion that, for example, Mario Draghi is really in favor of the 3% and in favor of austerity, and that you are in less favor? To who should we listen?
Well, you should make your own view at the end of the day, right? Because that's what...
We expect you all have the same...
No, but you're not going to be sheep following the shepherd. You're going to listen to all the views and you're going to try to form your own opinion. What we at the IMF have been saying is that debt in general, public debt of course, but debt in general, when it's too much, when it's too heavy, is like this big bag of stone that you carry on your back and which stops you from running. In order to reduce that weight of stones on your back, you have to reduce your deficit, because, you know, deficit is financed by debt, very simply, which is why we advocate that fiscal consolidation be continued. But we don't think that there is any magical effect about having a figure, because that figure will be moved one way or the other depending on the growth circumstances. When you don't have growth, you continue to cut your deficit, you try to reach that 3%, and it's a bit like a mirage. You know, you think you're just about to reach it, but growth, you know, moves under your feet like a carpet that you pull. So we are saying it has to consolidate, but not with the
in a sensible way.
exclusive focus on a number. It has to be structural, and it has to be tempered by the circumstances affecting the economy.
You just mentioned to make our own opinion.
Well, you're the future.
Yes, but does it also mean that you and Mario Draghi and Olje also have discussions about this fact?
Oh yeah.
Stimuleren, kritische vragen door studenten. Dus daar houdt
Something is
Well, we heard something interrupting. Well, so you have also on a personal level a discussion about that matter. I want to go on to the next subject because we're still talking about growth versus austerity because we're still in a crisis. It started 6 years ago with the banks. And now we have it still in a crisis. How is that possible? Because the American banking sector was recapitalized in 6 months instead of 6 years.
How is it possible that we still have problems with banks 6 years later while the crisis started?
Okay. What the United States did is, first of all, it started there, right? So they very promptly got to the bottom of it and really focused on the financial sector where it all started. Didn't mean to say that they fixed it, because they still had the housing problem on their hands. You know, back until about year and a half ago, the housing problem was a huge weight on the US economy. It's now bottoming up and they're coming out of it. But they dealt with the financial issues by putting together a huge financial package in order to recapitalize the banks. And they overshoot by a long way.
Yeah.
They have now been pretty much repaid by all the institutions, and they got most of their money back. In Europe, the treatment was different. And there was, I think, I was Minister of Finance in France at the time. I don't think that we immediately recognized the depth of the problem and the way in which European banks had been contaminated by the financial crisis that came out of the United States. And the curative measures that were taken very fast in the US were taken very slowly, and I don't think have yet been completed in Europe. So I think that we need to get to the bottom of that.
And is the banking union, is that the solution for our problems?
It is certainly a big portion of the solution. I think that, you know, to the extent that you have a common supervisor, you have a common resolution system, you have a resolution framework in place, hopefully a resolution authority, and a common backstop to make sure that it all works, and that the ESM or other funds are used properly, then I think there would be solidarity within Europe.
If we implemented the banking system, should that mean that, well, in a case, a bank in, for example, Spain, I don't want to blame Spain.
Don't blame Spain, because they have recapitalized their banks very much so far.
All right.
Let's take
for example,
take another one.
A country in the
X,
Eurozone.
yeah.
Country X in the Eurozone. For example, that bank goes bankrupt. Does it mean that a bank in the Netherlands should pay for that, should help that bank in the banking union?
If you take that bank X with no branches in the Netherlands, and that bank is going broke, then that needs to be sorted out using all the tools available in that country. And that should be harmonized as well on a at least pan-Eurozone basis. In other words, do you resolve the shareholders? Do you resolve the bondholders, junior and senior, and in what order? Do you resolve the big depositors? At what time does the national deposit guarantee fund kicks in? And once that is done, is there a role for the European banking union level to interfere? I think the situation again will vary depending upon whether it's a domestic bank. If it's a domestic bank, is it a systemically important institution in that country? Is it a bank that has ramification outside? And I think that will trigger the level of intervention and the level of tools and the size of tools that will be used. But this is very much work in progress, and I hope some of you are following what's happening at the European level with the European resolution discussion,
Yes.
the Resolution and Recovery Directive that is under review at the moment, because it will address those issues.
But for instance, Germany is not very keen on a speed process of the banking union. The Minister of Finance yesterday said. Is that important? Yeah. Well, how do you think about that? He's not.
Well, you need to have all the players at the table, and
You need those
it's
27 countries.
27 might be difficult, but 17 for sure, and hopefully more. You know, by
17
way
is not
of
difficult.
opting out, opting in. I don't know how it's going to work, but as many as possible would be ideal. But you know, I was part of that sort of European development process. It's work in progress all the time, and it takes energy, it takes patience. It frustrates and irritates observers and people who are impatient. But it moves. You know, there is a European momentum. If I look back to when I left the table of the ECOFIN as Minister of Finance, many things have changed. Better fiscal discipline, the European stability mechanism is in place, the commitment to put together a European supervisor, the Resolution and Recovery Directive, which is under discussion and hopefully will be completed before year-end. Those are major changes taking place on the European scene. Now, commentators, journalists, people who don't understand Europe will say, gosh, this is taking too long. Why do they procrastinate? Can't wait for them to do it. But it takes 17,
But when should
countries
it be
to come
there?
together.
Because Dijsselbloem wants to have a banking union the next year, and Draghi wants to have it in 2015. When do you want to have a banking union?
I think the sooner the better, but it has to come along with all the ingredients and, in the best possible scheme. But the sooner the better.
One last fact about the banking system in Europe. We have problems, of course, with those so-called zombie banks.
Yeah.
The fact is that we don't know where those zombie banks are, where they will exist in the future. And we have to amortize a lot on the European banking balances. How are we going to find those zombie banks?
I think central bankers, if you ask them, one-to-one, the question, they know who the zombie banks are. And I think that for the moment they are working hard on the Resolution and Recovery Directive. They're working hard on making sure that there is enough liquidity to respond to market demands. But that time, I think, will come.
But the European Central Bank, for example, they lowered the interest rate. And with that case, we can finance those zombie banks too. They can finance themselves really easy. So there will not be problems in those banks, and they still exist. Isn't that a problem?
A healthy banking system is needed, and I think is needed to allow the recovery to take off. So it's a chapter of the economy that European partners will have to deal with.
We have to amortize 1,000 or 3,000 billion euros in Europe on the whole banking system. That's what economists calculated.
I don't know your number, but
is it true that that's a number around that? If it's then probably there will become a lot of problems in the banking system still, isn't it?
Which is why it is important to have a European banking union, which is why it is important to have all the ingredients in place. If you only have the supervision system, it's one thing, it's good, but it's not enough. You need to have all the other components in place, which I think is a project that you, Minister of Finance, is very keen to work on. I didn't call him his first name.
we need the banking system to be aware of the problems when banking's balances still have to be
No. In the right order, you need it to have in place the ability to backstop. So they need to have available the tools to remedy the situation of those zombie banks that they will discover in the process, not the other way around. You need the money first to be able to stop the problem, and then you uncover.
That's the order. Well, Ms. Lagarde, we're coming to an end of our interview. We first had some turmoil, but you reacted very good on that. I have to.
It's part of life.
I'm complimenting you about that. It's not always a dream job, is it?
It's not what?
It's not always a dream job with people activating against you, or is it? It's a tension. That's also nice.
It's Well, I hope it certainly did not disturb you, and I would like to compliment you for your professionalism in dealing with it. That was really top class, and to thank the audience for their patience and their interest in what I very humbly say on behalf of the IMF. And I think that
we have one last question.
Okay.
Then we ask the applause. Sorry for interrupting you. I have to say something to the audience. We had some turmoil today, and probably you all noticed that. And I all want to thank you for being here and for being with that big crowd. No question? No, we had one student question left, but we're running out of time.
Yeah.
One last.
Yeah.
One last. Oh.
This is Yannick Dijon.
Bonjour madame, je suis français, but
Bonjour,
I will ask my question in English.
Okay.
In France, the President Hollande is pretty weak nowadays. He's maybe the most unpopular person in France. In your own party on the right, the UMP, there's a struggle for the leadership between Jean-François Copé and François Fillon. Your mandate at the IMF is ending in 2016, and the next elections are in 2017. Can we expect you to run for these presidential elections in France?
That was a very nice question. Thank you.
But are you going to be the first female president of France?
No, I responded to his question. I said it was a very nice question. Thank you so much.
And that was your answer.
I think it would be perfect for the
With
job.
this audience, we really want to thank you. And well, Room for Discussion is a weekly discussion program, and I'm not going to have an
ending talk?
An ending talk. We have one last question. You're going to ask him?
No, you can ask it. It's okay.
I will ask it. As students in economics, we also want well, a life path as you had. Something like, maybe I also want to become the managing director of the International Monetary Fund. What would you advise the students who are in the audience to, for the rest of their life, for their life path?
One thing that we touched on earlier on, make sure you look after your body. I know it sounds silly of me to say that, but you don't get a second set. You can change your hip later on, you can change a few things, but your body is critical and it has to sustain you. So I would say that's point number one. Point number two, always learn. Always educate yourself, always challenge yourself, always be prepared to just, you know, challenge the conventional wisdom that you carry with you. And I would say, I'm a bit reluctant to say it because it's tough to conduct many agendas at the same time and to deal with lots of constraints. But the sky is the limits, and you are imposing on yourself constraints that actually don't exist. You can't do it all at the same time, and I'm here especially thinking about the women and the girls in the audience. It's very difficult to juggle lots and lots of things, and we end up carrying a lot more of the burden of the children and the house work and all the rest of it. But don't assume that you have limits because of that. It's a question of timing, it's a question of balancing, it's a question of organizing yourself, but you know, don't refrain the potential that you have. And always be prepared to give other people a hand, because we cannot achieve anything just by ourselves.
No,
ladies and gentlemen, Christine Lagarde.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the turmoil.
That's all right.
Really
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With our committee who organized it.
Thank you.
Ms. Lagarde, with the committee who organized this, there are